Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to be looking at Unit 6.1, Rationales for Imperialism, and we're going to be looking at how the ideologies contributed to the development of imperialism from 1750 to 1900. Okay, and we can see here in the College Board Curriculum Framework, right, really we're looking at things that justified imperialism, cultural, religious, racial ideologies, things such as social Darwinism, nationalism, civilizing missions, and such. Okay, so we're going to be looking at this era, and the general way I would kind of start introducing this topic is by trying to look at and I guess kind of make some comparisons with colonialism, right, versus imperialism, and is this the same as colonialism, or is there a distinction? Or maybe another way to put it, using scale words, is what aspects of imperialism are a continuity and what aspects of imperialism are a change? And just kind of think about that. Think back to the 1500s and the 1600s and 1700s, and how is what's going on in this time period different than that time period that we had seen before. All right. So, right, in what ways does this constitute a change or not? Right. All right. So go ahead and take a moment, think about that, and then all right. All right. So, what did you come up with for continuities? All right. And give me 1 second. I'm just trying to pull up my Elmo. It's not working for some reason right now. I don't know why it's not working. Let me minimize this. Image mate. Oh, you know why? Normally I would probably there we go. All right, that's it. I had unplugged it. All right, so when we talk about imperialism and whether it is a continuity or a change or not, let's just kind of look at, let's look at kind of a couple of basic things here. One is who are we even talking about and what's going on here? So when we talk about colonialism, all right, we're talking about colonialism in the 1500s, right? Who dominated the 1500s? Portugal, right? Portugal, in the Indian Ocean, right? The whole trade post, right? The whole trade post empire phenomenon, in the 1600s, this is definitely, Spain's moment. And obviously this is not an exact thing. There's going to be overlaps in the such. Because obviously Potosi comes online in 1545, and Spain colonizes the Philippines in 1571, and global trade begins. And so obviously there's overlap here, but kind of who do we often think about when we think of these centuries? In the 1700s, who comes to dominate that? This is really the Dutch century, and what they're doing. So Spain is like Latin America. The Dutch in, what is today, Indonesia, right? So the Dutch colonies, and specifically we're talking about the work of the DOC, in the 1800s, right? This is the era where the British come to dominate. And obviously what we're going to see with imperialism during this time is, obviously there's going to be a lot of other countries that are involved here, right? But when it comes to the, imperialism, the British are often what we kind of think is the dominant one. And obviously this is going to bleed into the 20th century. I mean, the British Empire will not reach its greatest extent until the 1930s, but it's during the 1800s that we start to, you start to hear that whole, the sun never sets on the British Empire kind of verbiage. And I guess in a lot of ways that was probably true by the time we even get to the late 1700s, since Australia gets colonized. in the 1770s. All right, but yeah, so we're talking about imperialism here. So in what ways? Evaluate the extent to which imperialism was colonialism 2.0, right? So what are the continuities that we associate with, with imperialism? And, one of the easy ways to start this is you can look at the reasons for imperialism versus justifications, right? The reasons for imperialism versus the justifications. Now, if you read the slide for a second, the gold, God, and glory of colonialism 1.0 is done. And what are the new verbiage for this? It's raw materials and markets for goods, right? Becomes the new thing. But is this really a change, right? So let's just look at this one here. Raw materials, right? Raw materials, or maybe a better way to put that, right, would be resource extraction. All right, so is this really different than what was going on with, first wave colonialism? I mean, really, it's not, right? Colonialism is about extracting resources from colonies, resources from the ground, resources from the land. What's really different here, the change here isn't the fact that we're extracting resources. The change here is what resources, right? So, so raw materials, right? So why are the British taking over, the Raj or British India in the 1860s? It's not for silver, like what the Spanish wanted from South America. It's cotton production, right? So raw materials, right, and markets, right? Markets to sell goods, right? So we can kind of categorize this in a couple of ways. If you're going to start talking about imperialism, right, is there's a lot of continuities. Right, there's a lot of continuities to this, and a lot of these continuities fall under the categories of, right, if you want to kind of put some categories up here, reasons, right, reasons for imperialism, right, reasons for imperialism versus justifications, right, and in your Strayer homework, you got a lot of justifications and not reasons. Right, so what are the reasons for imperialism? A lot of, there's basically three that we need to be aware of right now. Two of them are continuities. Right, so these raw materials, this is an actual reason for imperialism. Markets, right, markets to sell manufactured goods. Right, markets to sell manufactured goods, that's another reason. Right, and then there's one new one here that would constitute a change, and that would be nationalism. Right, nationalism as a reason for imperialism. This is a new one that we're seeing during this time frame. All right, so those are our basic reasons. Right, everything that we're going to go over really from this point on is now going to become a justification for imperialism. And as I said, Strayer's homework for last night deals a lot with justifications for imperialism. So we're going to look at these concepts. We might use different words. Like Strayer, for example, uses the words scientific racism. What else does Strayer use? Like civilizing missions, right? And those are the kind of verbiage that we kind of see coming out of Strayer. And we're going to go over a couple of those and just kind of maybe give you some different ways that still fall under these. And these become pretty good categories of analysis if you're trying to argue what are the causes of imperialism. Justifications for imperialism, such as scientific racism. These are good thesis kind of phrases, right? Good categories of analysis, right? So good reasons for imperialism. Right, extraction of raw materials, markets. Right, so just basic essay writing kind of stuff. All right, so let's look at one of these justifications for imperialism, and let's just take take this one. Now, based on the two categories of analysis that we just looked at, would this fall under a scientific racism or a civilizing mission? Right, so we'll come back to that question in a moment. All right, so this is the kind of a social excuse, right? Or that might even be a different way of looking at this. This notion of the white man's burden, right? So, so when we do this in class, what I'll often do is we'll source this document, and then we'll kind of break this document down a little bit. So first off, what is this? Like, what is this poem, right? And this is obviously a very short excerpt from a much larger poem. So it says White Man's Burden, 1899. That's all we really have thus far. So first off, who wrote this, right? And the author is a man named Rudyard Kipling. And so in class, I'll often ask, like, is anyone familiar with any of Kipling's works? And every once in a while, one of my students will know that Kipling is the person who wrote Jungle Book, that you might be familiar with from Disney, Disney cartoons or live action movies that it was just recreated into. So Kipling wrote, right, Jungle Book, also writes this piece here, right? So before we kind of get into this, who is the intended audience, right? So, and I like this image to kind of correspond, because a lot of my students are, a lot of you don't know this off the top of your head. So, so what I'll do is use the image to kind of help answer this question. Who is the intended audience of this poem? Right. So first off, Kipling, let's kind of make sure you eliminate this person, because this is a British, right? You're kind of symbolic British person. Kipling, British, spends most of his life living in the British Raj, in India, right? Travels to South Africa quite a bit as well. So really believes in the British mission of colonialism, all right? Kind of really believes in what they're doing. And he writes this piece in 1899. So what's going on, what's going on in the world in just before this? So assuming you have a basic understanding of American history, what happens in American history in 1898? And very rarely, so if you don't know that off the top of your head right now, don't feel bad. Very rarely do I have a student actually, come right out and say the Spanish American War, right? Oftentimes someone will say, like, the Maine, remember the Maine, so they'll remember, Havana Harbor. Sometimes people remember Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, so before he was president, every once in a while, someone might say something like the yellow journalism, right, that comes out of this era. Things that you probably picked up when you were an 8th grader taking your U.S. history class. But this is the Spanish-American War. So how does this relate back to what we're talking about? What does the U.S. pick up as a result of this Spanish-American War? Well, it picks up a number of the, it picks up a number of Spanish colonies when we defeat the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. So obviously, if you know who Teddy Roosevelt is and the Rough Riders, we pick up Cuba. Maybe you know that we pick up Puerto Rico, and also, most people know that we pick up the Philippines, during the, as a result of the Spanish-American War. So we pick these up in 1898, and then a major debate, occurs in the United States. Do we take over and assume colonial rule of these new places that we have just acquired? Or do we, because we're the United States, do we grant sovereignty and self-rule? We are a country that was formed as a result of breaking away from colonialism. Should we now become a colonial authority, a colonial power? So there's a big debate, going on at this time. So Kipling chimes in here, right? So I'm going to read through this real quick with you, and then we can I'll show you how we'll break this down, right, in class. So take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness, unfluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hopes to naught. So, having just heard that, is Kipling weighing in on the side that the United States should extend democracy in self-rule to Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and other former colonies of the Spanish, or should they assume colonial rule? right? So the answer is really obvious there, right? So, and then what we'll often do in class here is we'll kind of break this down, what is Kipling explicitly saying here? Because it's, he's using poetry and there's a lot of alluded to things, and also some language that you might not be familiar with, right? So what we're seeing here is, calling for this idea of the British Foreign Service, or what is in place as the British Foreign Service, that once your brightest students, once they are wrapped up their academic careers, right, towards the end of their university years, that they need to go and serve some time in the colonies, all right? And then why they need to go there, right? You have this kind of embedded education is required, religious purposes as well, maybe. What might be one way to interpret that. This idea that you also need to have, right, some military force. Right, if your goal is to end famine and to bring modern medicine to these colonies, you might need to have wars. You might need to actually pacify these populations. They might, these colonies might resist you, even though you're simply trying to end famine and bring medicine. And of course, Kipling is writing this before things really kind of break out in the Philippines, because we're going to see in the Philippines in the first years of the 20th century a real bloody resistance movement against American colonialism. Right, so there will be savage wars of peace, right, in order for you to help them. And then of course you get down to here. This last bit, this is that what the white man's burden is, or what the actual burden is no matter how much you might attempt, as a to educate or to bring food, you are going to have your hopes dashed. Okay, so why do it in the first place, right? So, I mean, this is, if you kind of look at this, this is what the burden that Kipling is referring to, that, no matter how hard you try, you're eventually going to fail, but that is a burden you must carry, according to Kipling. So why is that? Why must you carry this burden? Because it is a moral responsibility that you have, right? So, right, and in this image, kind of just look at this image that was published, as a kind of a visual representation of the poem. You're seeing, right, depicted here the United States, and who is depicted. And you'll often see Amerindians being depicted here as well, just because first wave of American imperialism is that whole manifest destiny, right? So that gets kind of lumped into this Kipling thing, even though it's much earlier. Occurs much earlier than this Kipling thing, right? But so you're seeing here the ultimate goal, and you're seeing the burden that has to be carried and the inherent obstacles that have to be overcome, right, in order to fulfill this goal, right? So this is what we would call, kind of looking at this. This is a justification for imperialism, right? So getting back to our kind of what your homework was last night. What category of analysis would this fall under, right? Hopefully you are able to successfully identify this as a civilizing mission, all right? All right, so one of the things I'll then kind of look at is was there any opposition to this concept, at the time, right? And, the answer is yes. This is not a situation where everyone necessarily buys into this kind of stuff. We do have a case of a rebuttal, right, that was written in the decades after this, so 1920. We have a rebuttal piece that is written called "The Black Man's Burden," and Edmund Moreau, he's kind of an interesting character, interesting case. He works for the corporation that is operating in the Belgian Congo, and as an accountant for that corporation, working at the docks, he's looking at the profits that are being generated, and he comes to the conclusion that those profits can only be acquired through some form of coerced labor, maybe a form of slavery. He doesn't know. Right. So what he does is he then begins interviewing people who are coming home, writing all that down, taking the photographs that are coming out of the Congo. And we in class, and I'm sure you remember, we watched that video about the rubber, the effects of vulcanization of rubber on the Congo. right? This is the person or one of the major people who kind of brings what was going on in the Congo to light. So he accumulates this information and then begins a publication, a weekly publication where these things are brought to light. And of course he himself writes a poem, right? Black Man's Burden. And you can read through this, and he's not using the kind of illusionary language that we see with Kipling. This is very straightforward and to the point. It's a critique, right? So there's no need to have any illusions at all about what it is he's criticizing. He's very straightforward with this, right? So it is the Africans who carry the black man's burden. The white man has massacred the African heaps. The white man has carved broad and bloody avenues from one end of Africa to the other. For 3 centuries, the white man seized and enslaved millions of Africans and transported them with every circumstance of ferocity, cruelty across the seas. Still, the Africans survived, and in his land of exile, multiplied exceedingly. But the Maxim gun, the rifle, the slave gang, labor, the bowels of the earth, the lash have failed to do. What imported measles, smallpox, syphilis have failed to do. What even the overseas slave trade failed to do. The modern capitalistic exploitation, assisted by modern engines of destruction, may yet succeed in accomplishing. Right. So specifically referencing the kind of activities that were going on in the Congo. The purpose is clear. It is to make the African all over Africa a servile race, to exploit African labor and through African labor, right, the soil of Africa for their own exclusive benefit, resource extraction, right, and then he goes on. Right, so there is arguments or critiques against. Okay, all right. Other justifications, right? Justifications, religious justifications, right? Religious justifications, and you really have kind of 2 things here. One is, religious justification as in missionary activity and conversion would be a continuity. The religious excuse of abolition, that would be a change, right? So that we see here, during this time period. So European missions, right? They'll increase dramatically during the 19th century. And of course, we do see straight up imperialism take place to put an end to slavery. Probably the most well-known case would have been in 1890 with Zanzibar, where the British will take over Zanzibar as a way to end the East African slave trade in the Indian Ocean, specifically, mostly going to the Middle East, to the Gulf states. All right, so saving souls. All right, this next piece is a very famous piece as well. A very famous image from Imperialism. So this is Cecil Rhodes, and most people know Cecil Rhodes. Not really for kind of his work in the gold mines initially in South Africa, but for the trading of diamonds and his part, as kind of a co-owner initially of the De Beers, right? The De Beers company, kind of most famously for diamonds, right? Diamond trading, diamond merchants, right? So, right, when we look at this, what we also need to understand is that he becomes the governor of South Africa, the colony of South Africa, and sometimes referred to as the architect of apartheid. Apartheid means separateness in Afrikaner, so that racial segregation policy, that eventually gets up and running, right? That eventually gets up and running in the, as we kind of get into the 20th century, so you could say he draws his inspiration from the Jim Crow South, right, in the United States. All right, so what are we seeing here in this image? This is portrayed on a couple levels. A good idea, because I do this in class, is just take a moment, try to interpret what you're trying to see. Like, what's the main idea of this image? All right. So now that you've taken a minute to do that, he dreams of the red line from the Cape to Cairo. Well, where are his feet? Right, where are his feet? Right, his left foot is on Cairo, and his right is on the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. Right, and what is the red line? Right, this is a railroad line that was the dream of the British, or at least of Rhodes. That will be planned. It will be attempted on some small levels, but never actually completed. Right, so the Cape to Cairo rail line, or red line, is what you're seeing as an idea here. And of course, what's in his hand if you're going to colonize and fully take advantage of the being able to exploit the raw materials that are in Africa? You need this industrial era technology, And of course, that technology you're seeing there is the telegraph line, right, in his hands. Okay. All right. I'm not going to, I didn't spend much time on this in class at all, just because this is a little bit of review, because we talked about this in the last unit. The factors that enabled industrial imperialism to take place occur as a result of industrialization. These new methods of transportation, communication, the steamboat, the train, the telegraph, right? These enable colonization to take place. The Suez Canal. We've talked about quinine already as one of these enabling factors for colonization to take place in Africa. And of course, the only thing I really do spend time on is kind of one of these, this relatively cooperation that occurs, as a result of kind of late industrialization and this notion of the Berlin Conference. So what we're seeing with the Berlin Conference is, first off, Germany is late to the game. And, when we talk about Germany, right, it's kind of a good idea to make sure you know that, like, when Germany, comes into existence technically in 1871 as we know it, right? And when we talk about the Berlin Conference, right, that occurs in 1885, right? And what Germany wants is and sometimes you'll kind of see this referred to as its place, right, in the sun, right? It wanted its colony. It wanted a colony in Africa or the Pacific, right, or the Indian Ocean world. And of course, because it's so late to join, the game, right? They take a very lead role in how things are going to move forward after 1885. So we'll look at the Berlin Conference later on in the unit. But we do see a period of relative cooperation amongst the European powers from 1885, at least to the turn of the 20th century, and then at that point you start to see that cooperation starts to break down to a large degree, and then obviously 1914 is going to be World War I, and that cooperation officially comes to an end at that point. All right, so we've already seen this malaria video. We've already gone over the other things with quinine. We've talked about the Suez Canal in Unit 5, so I don't want to get into this. One last little thing as far as excuses, right, and this is we call social Darwinism, right? So, Strayer, Strayer, I guess, refers to this as social racism, scientific racism, right? So using science. This is kind of an interesting, kind of case study to look at, because in a lot of ways, when Darwin's ideas get published, there's going to be a lot of resistance to Darwin's ideas. However, we're also going to see the wide-scale application of Darwin's ideas at the same time that you're going to see wide-scale resistance to Darwin's ideas. So wide-scale acceptance of Darwin's ideas is when you're applying it to whole societies, right? If it's being applied by Europeans or the United States, right, in this case. Or the Japanese will also apply these ideas, right, of social Darwinism. Okay, so imperialism is a scientific inevitability. All right. So the last little thing we do in class is we'll look at some of these images, and so I guess this will become, if you're watching this from home, you can submit this via email to make sure you let us know that you're out there. So describe what you're looking at, right? So describe what this event is, and when I do this in class, we do this in two ways. One is, right, let me kind of just pull it up and I'll write it down for you, what I'm looking for each image. All right, so one is describe, right? And then next would be, is this a reason? Is this a wrong place. Is this a reason or justification? Right? Is this a reason for imperialism or is this justification? And then explain. Right? And then explain. Right? Why? All right. So, and I don't need this done in full sentences, like 2-3 words will be enough. And I'm going to go over and give you an example of the first one. So let's look at this. So what is our meaning? What are we seeing here? So we're seeing a gold mine, right? We're seeing a gold mine. We can infer that this is probably in South Africa or near South Africa. And, what is, and is this a reason for imperialism, or is this a justification for imperialism? All right, so what I would really want for this one here is, let's kind of put this up here. One is it's a gold mine. All right, this is a gold mine. Let's just put in Africa. Right. And then the next question is that a reason or justification? Right. This is a reason. And why is it a reason? Based on what we had said earlier, because we're talking about extraction of resources, right, or raw materials. All right, so does that make sense? All right, so you're going to be doing that for all these images. So I'm going to walk you through these, all right, and the next one is the same. So I'm not going to have you do this one. This is another mine, right? This is another mining portrayal. Is this a reason or justification? This is a reason for imperialism. This is extraction of resources. All right, so here we go. This is an image. Notice the flag to kind of give you a hint of where this is. Notice, right? Try to make an assertion of where it is based on the visual clues, right, and what's going on. And so based on where it is, I guess you could try to infer whether or not this is a reason for imperialism or justification for imperialism, and explain why. All right, so this is what we do in class. So, all right, next image. So, all right, describe what you're seeing here. You might want to look up this word. This might give you a hint if you look this word up. So, is this a reason for imperialism or a justification for imperialism? Okay. All right, so describe what you're seeing here. Is this a reason for imperialism or a justification for imperialism? And why? All right, same thing. Reason for imperialism or justification for imperialism? I'm going to skip that one here. Let's just go to this one. Reason for imperialism or justification for imperialism? I'm curious what you're going to put as far as your reason for justification. Which one of the multiple angles? All right, and this will be the last one. All right, so describe what you're seeing here. And is this a reason for imperialism or a justification for imperialism? And then why? And there's actually a couple of interesting possible answers for this one. All right, so if you're looking for a quick word bank on this, these are some of the angles you could use in addition to the ones that I've already provided. Okay, and let's wrap this up. So imperialism is fundamentally motivated by the demands created by the rise of industrial societies, right? Raw materials factories needed to produce goods, market to sell goods. And then we have a bunch of whole secondary justifications. You realize what's being done at home, benefit imperialist endeavors by providing essential services to the colonies themselves, right? And if you're looking for some other kind of angles at this, let me just kind of, if you kind of scroll up from where you are currently watching this, you do have kind of a different breakdown of this, okay? And to kind of give you some more arguments in addition to the ones that we've already looked at. Okay. All right. So that is all for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to email them, and please email me your answers to those images, whether or not they were reasons or justifications. All right. Sapriati.